One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. In this day and age, brewers strive to produce beers that are as clean as possible, meaning they're not contaminated and have no off flavors. However, in the earlier days of brewing, before the field of microbiology even existed, there's evidence to suggest that most beers possessed at least some level of contamination, which brewers in certain regions leaned into and continue to capitalize on today. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss our experiences brewing sour beer using more traditional methods is contributor Jordan Folks.
Yeah, sour beers, such an incredible opportunity for us kind of modern brewers to kind of really dive into some of those really traditional, and going back to the medieval ages, as it were, to really explore some of the more, interesting flavors that can really be had in this beverage.
Absolutely. And I like how you point out just how old this style is. I mean, there was a lot of talk, when I started getting into sour beers, and I feel like it was about 10 years ago, really started to get popular in the homebrewing worlds, even in the craft beer worlds. There was a lot of talk about how these are like the most historical styles, because most beers back then had some level of contamination. And like I said, brewers in certain regions kind of held on to that. Now, lager styles are often talked about as being what brewers tend to avoid due to how difficult they can be to make. And while that certainly was true for me for some time, I'd have to say that I was even more afraid of brewing sour beers for a number of reasons. We're going to be getting into that, as well as our experiences making different types of sour beer using more traditional methods later in this episode. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at yakimavalleyhops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. We've got all kinds of great rewards for the month of February. Yakima Valley Hops is giving patrons $7 off each 1 pound bag of Australian Eclipse 2022, the freshest there is out there right now. And also, this month's guest is Clay Disney from Jaded Brewing, makers of some of the world's fastest immersion chillers. I've known Clay for almost as long as Brewlosophy's been around. In fact, he was our very first real sponsor, and the fact that he is still around is something we're really grateful for. In addition to his expertise on chilling, Clay is just a fun dude who's sure to put on a great session. To be a part of it, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more over at patreon.com/brewlosophy no later than Friday, February 24th, 2023, as Clay is going to be taking questions that Saturday the 24th. I believe it's February 23rd. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for that referral. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to leave those ratings and reviews, we really would appreciate that as well. Thanks to everybody who has rated and reviewed this show already. We are getting so close to that 1,000 review mark in Apple Podcasts, which doesn't really mean much, but it is kind of a cool milestone for us. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a killer YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Brian from the incredible exBEERience Brewing blog wrote in with a bit of clarification on something that we discussed in our last Brew and A episode. Brian said, I just finished episode 270 and had a comment about the last segment where you and Cade were discussing metabisulfite. I'm writing to point out that the idea that using metabisulfite can cause sulfur off flavors or aromas is more of a myth than it is a fact. What metabisulfite does when it's dissolved into a liquid depends on that liquid's pH. At a pH typical of finished beer, 4.0 to 4.5, it forms the sulfite ion, SO3 negative. These do not have an aroma and have no appreciable flavor at the levels Brewlosophy recommends for beer. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, is the gas that causes most of the sulfur off aromas in beer. This can form from metabisulfite, but this requires a pH of 3.5 or lower. So this can be an issue with wine or sour beer, but is not going to be an issue with the conventional beers. Brewers with sulfur issues are far more likely to have a fermentation issue than an issue with too much potassium metabisulfite. I'm a big metabisulfite fan myself. A while ago, I did a split beer experiment where I aged a barley wine half with potassium metabisulfite. He used 0.6 grams for 5 gallons. You really don't need much of this stuff at all. And half without. For the first 2 years, there wasn't much of a difference between the bottles, but after that time, the non-sulfited bottles aged pretty quickly and were undrinkable at the 4-year mark. The sulfited bottles remained good for an additional 2 years and didn't start to go off until over 6 years old. I think that's pretty rad. What do you say, Jordan?
That is really interesting. I haven't messed around much with the post fermentation editions of that. I've had a couple times where I had an IPA that I could not transfer it out of the dry hop keg, and so I had to pull out the old racking cane, and that's a oxidation nightmare.
Exactly.
So, you can use a little bit of that to kind of overcorrect when you have kind of emergency brew day disasters like that, and I swear I was getting a little bit of sulfur. And one time it was like, whoa, this is way too much. So I'm really wondering, was this a bias associated with the fear of sulfur? I don't know. I've mostly used it on the hot side. It's kind of that like Lodo kind of mash oxidation mitigation technique.
Yep.
So now I think this really empowers me to use it more on the cold side as well.
Yeah, to reduce the risk of oxidation occurring in finished beer. I love the idea. I like you, Jordan, I haven't done it very often. I think I've done it once actually at kegging, and I did it just to see if I was going to get sulfur, and I didn't. I've been pretty open about that I've not gotten sulfur from the use of potassium metabisulfite in finished beer. Where I use, and the reason I have metabisulfite, both sodium and potassium, is to, I use it like Campton tablet. I put it in my water to clear out any chloramine or chlorine. I don't have chloramines in my local water here, but I use it for chlorine purposes, not necessarily to mitigate cold side oxidation, because my kegging process is basically closed. So I'm force transferring with CO2 into CO2 purged kegs and all of that. But I really appreciate what Brian has to say. And I love that we get feedback from people like Brian, who I have a massive amount of respect for. His blog, exBEERience.com. That's SUIGENERIS, brewing.com, is truly incredible. We tend to focus more on the sensory side of things, but Brian digs so deep into the harder science, which is fascinating stuff. I appreciate the clarification, Brian. Thank you so much for doing what you do, and keep doing it, please. We really do like it. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you're not already subscribed to the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, go do it now. We dropped our first episode last week, which it was super exciting for us, and we're going to be pushing new episodes out on a weekly basis henceforth. You can find our channel by searching for The Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, or more directly by going to youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. All right, time for a quick break. When we return, we'll be discussing our experiences with traditional sour beer brewing. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When I started homebrewing, I was taught that all bugs, I put that in air quotes, the term used for anything that wasn't brewer's use essentially, were bad and should be avoided at all cost. As I met more brewers, this seemed a fairly common sentiment. Not only do microbes like Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, and Brettanomyces lead to off flavors, but they can infect your entire brewery, making it nearly impossible to produce clean beer after you've already made these dirty beers, as it were. It took me over 10 years to realize just how misinformed I'd been. I was introduced to some delicious sour beers, commercial sour beers, as well as versions made by friends of mine, which is when I finally mustered the courage to dip my toes in sour beer brewing. Jordan, what was it that ultimately motivated you to make your own sour beer?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking back to kind of the craft beer boom of like 2010 or so, Belgian and sour beer was really driving that conversation.
Yeah.
Obviously, hoppy pale ales, etc., were coming on the scene and people were really digging into those. But it really seems that this American craft beer movement was rooted in the Belgian tradition. And when you look back at some of the more old school craft brewers like Allagash, that's really where they came from. And so I think that there's always kind of been this fascination with Belgian beers, both sour and not. And it was like sour beer was kind of this like, archetype of the craft beer experience, right?
Yeah.
And kind of thinking back to the IBU wars of 2010 or so, there was also really abrasively sour beer as well. And kind of this like, who can handle the sourest beer, And so I think that there was just a lot of interest back in the day around the style, but almost no one was making them at home. And so, traditionally, before we had 20 craft breweries in every neighborhood, one of the reasons you brewed beer at home was to make styles you couldn't easily access.
Yeah.
And you can't walk into Safeway and get a Cantillon. And so I was really inspired by the movement, and there was like Michael Tonsmeyer with the Mad Fermentationist, a little bit of information starting to trickle out. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I got to figure this out. And so, just went in head first.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, my first experience with sour beer was during a hangout with some brewing friends of mine. It had to have been 11 or 12 years ago at this point. A guy showed up with a few bottles of the brewery, from the brewery out of Orange County. They're, a fairly well-known brewery for their sour beers and big beers and really cool stuff. Well, these things just blew me away. In my head, I'd convinced myself that sour meant gross, but these beers were just beautiful. Now, again, this was 11, 12 years ago. I'd been drinking nothing but normal, clean beer. And I recollect these beers just being so assertively tart. But I've had the same beers since then. I'm sure they're newer batches, and they're not nearly as tart as I thought they were back then. It's kind of like the whole IBU threshold thing where you start to learn to deal with bitterness the more you have bitter beers. To me, it's the same with sour. The more familiar these beers get to you, the less tart they might come across. Now, I've definitely had some enamel peeling, sour beers that are just awful, hurt your mouth after you drink them. But for the most part, I remember having those brewery beers, and then that's kind of piqued my interest. I wasn't planning on brewing sour beers yet. And then I went on a trip to Santa Rosa with my family and a friend, and we stopped in, Russian River, and you can buy there. If you ever go to Russian River in Santa Rosa, now there's one up in, I believe it's Windsor as well. They give you can get a full flight. And I'm telling you, this is like the biggest flight you've ever seen. And like a quarter of the flight is their sour beers. And that was the point where I was like, okay, this this is good stuff. Like, wow, I cannot believe I've been avoiding this for so long, or that it got such a negative, I guess, kind of perspective spun on it by people who were afraid of infecting their brewery. I'm a huge sour beer fan. I still don't consider myself by any means an expert on this stuff, but I love trolling Milk the Funk and reading the American Sour Beers by Michael Tonsmeyer. I was fortunate enough to go on a trip to New Zealand with Michael Tonsmeyer, and he was, talking about sour beers and things like little tricks that he'd been playing since writing the book. And it's just one of the things about sour beer brewing is that it does have it possesses this element of romanticism. It is one of some of the oldest styles. And like you said, I mentioned earlier that there were certain regions who leaned into the contamination, and is it contaminated if you intend it to be? I don't know. But Belgium is obviously the country that I'm thinking the most of, though there are other regions. Germany has some interesting, low ABV sour beers like Berliner Weiss and such that are brewed using even different methods. But when I think of traditional sour beers, I go to Belgium in my mind for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's where my mind goes as well. And we've obviously really embraced the funk here in America as well. And there's a lot of breweries that are really diving into the traditional Belgian traditions like Allagash, Rare Barrel, the Russian River. And so, but I think that if you ask any of those kind of watermark American sour beer brewers, who's inspired you, they're going to say Belgium.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So when you think about, I feel like we need to distinguish what we mean when we say traditional versus the opposite of traditional. When obviously I think most people who have been in the craft beer or brewing scene, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, understands that traditional methods are different from what a lot of people are doing nowadays with quick turnaround sours, where they might just be adding, lactic acid to reduce the pH to give it that tart experience. They might be using some form of bacteria that is known to quickly, increase or decrease the pH by increasing the acid level. We're not that is not what our focus is today. To me, when I think about traditional sour beer brewing, it just means taking an approach that pulls from history, not necessarily doing everything that Cantillon does, but relying on certain methods that tend to take time. Right? It's distinct from these more modern approaches to making sour beer that take way less time. I mean, I've turned kettle sour beers around in like 3 weeks, like the normal amount of time to brew a standard clean beer. So I'm in no way dissing quick sour methods. In fact, we're going to do a show on that in the future, and I've had phenomenal sours made that way. Our focus today is just our experience on these traditional methods. How's that sound to you, Jordan? Are you kind of in line with the traditional is kind of a loose term that I'm using here to talk about more historical approaches to making sour beer?
Yeah, I mean, I think effectively, and for the purposes of this conversation, when we say traditional, we mean not quick soured.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And
yeah,
there might be some examples of really old traditional breweries using some sort of quick souring type method, but it seems that a lot of those breweries that may be doing that now, such as on the German side, historically were doing mixed fermentation. And so I think that that's probably really a key phrase to define traditional sour beer brewing for the purposes of today's episode, is it's a mixed fermentation product where you are using fermentation and acidification are happening either in tandem, or fermentation first and acidification second. And that may or may not be barrel aged. Historically, traditionally, that definitely would have been true. And then there are obviously some traditional sour beer styles, which have their own methods and recipes and processes associated with them, such as Oud Bruin or Lambic or Goose and so on and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when we focus more on that historical or traditional approach to sour beer, there are some arguments that can be made about, what makes those better? What makes that approach, I guess, more desirable than doing the quick turnaround? Again, we are not dissing the quick sour thing. We're going to do a whole episode on that in the future as well. Now, some of the purported benefits of these traditional methods, and one that I kind of agree with, again, this is my experience, is that it can create a more complex beer, more complex flavors, these layering these layers of flavors, as people like to describe them, that aren't just unidimensional. It's not just that single line of like, wow, this is this style of beer that has sourness with it. It becomes kind of its own thing, the gestalt, right, of this sour beer. And that is something that has been my experience with sour beers that are brewed, these long, that take a long time to make as well. Other things that I think a lot of people kind of like to hang their hat on when it comes to these traditional methods is that you are honoring, the historical approach. You're kind of tapping into the way people did things a long time ago, using obviously more modern, gear and such. But those are kind of the main benefits that I can think of when it comes to traditional sour beer brewing methods. What about you, Jordan?
Yeah, I definitely agree on the complexity thing. I mean, a big difference is that traditional sour beers tend to have Brettanomyces present, and you won't really be relying on that in a quick sour method. Yeah. So just right off the bat, you have some additional complexity there. There's also some additional, flavor compounds, et cetera, that are generated in a spontaneous fermentation, which we'll definitely need to dive into today, which is fundamentally different from not only a quick sour, but even a, co-pitched kind of easier approach when you're adding microbes.
Yeah.
So definitely the complexity is ramped up. And, that can go in either direction. Like we said, there's some traditional sour beers out there that are too sour. And so working on honing that in, I think, is important. But really for me, which is, I think, kind of ironic, is in some ways, the traditional method is kind of easier. Because you brew, assuming we're not getting into the turbid mash schedule just yet. We'll talk about that in a bit, I think.
Yeah.
But, you do a simple grist, you do a simple boil, and you add your microblend, and you walk away for a year. I mean, how easy is that? And so we'll talk about blending, I think, later in the podcast. But, with the quick sour, you got to do your certain temperature, and you got to come back the next day, and you got to reboil. And it's actually, although it might take less time in terms of like grain to glass, it's a little bit more involved in some ways. Yeah,
it's so funny because I was sitting here when I was putting my notes together. I'm thinking, all right, what are the the benefits that I feel? My experience. What have I enjoyed about traditional sour beers that I've made, and then what are some of the downsides? The biggest downside is you have to be patient. I mean, it takes a lot longer, right? And that is a tough thing, especially if you're a newer brewer. If you have a bunch of carboys, you can stow one away in a closet and just let it sit there for 12 plus months and you're good. Maybe forget about it. I've had friends who have done that, and you come back 18, 24 months later and they're just like, whoa, taste this beer that I forgot about, but that is really the biggest downside in my opinion. The other thing is that in speaking about the contamination of downstream gear, right, of things that you're going to use in the future, with traditional sour beer brewing, you're typically not killing off or getting rid of the bacteria or the microbes in general that made that beer what it is. And so there's an argument to be made that it could be more difficult to then clean and sanitize that for clean beers in the future. So you see a lot of sour beer brewers who use these methods that just have dedicated gear for sour beer brewing on this level. And that makes sense to me. I don't know if that's a huge downside. It just means that if you're going to make clean beers, you do have to have kind of another set of cold side gear.
Yeah, and the old school method was that when it was time to retire your traditional clean beer racking cane, et cetera, because you've been using it for a few years, you just donate that to the sour side of your brewery.
Exactly.
And so it's really not that hard. And how much is vinyl tubing, right? And so it's not that big of a deal. And I will say that a lot of sour beer makers at home have never had a contaminated clean beer batch. And so granted, I am have cold side versus hot side tubing and stuff, but it's really not that hard to make both in your basement.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who is never, that I can recall, I've never had a unintentionally contaminated batch of beer, and I've gone back and forth with my stuff. Now, in the next segment, we're going to break down our experiences using different methods. I think you're gonna shine on that one, Jordan, because you have far more experience than I do with these approaches. But what I thought we could do now is just talk about some of our experiences with things that we've brewed, share our experiences brewing Oud Bruin or Flanders Red Ale, Flemish Red Ale, whatever it is, and share those stories. My like you mentioned, my thing with traditional sour beer brewing is I was terrified to screw up my gear that I was using. So when I finally decided to do it was when I went and got these like 8.5 gallon buckets that I was using for all my clean beer. And I had 2 glass carboys, the very first carboys I ever got with my kit back in 2003, whatever it was, 2002, I think. And I used those. I was like, these will just be my dedicated, traditional sour beer carboys. And I think the first one I made was back in March of 2013. This was pre-Brewlosophy. My brother-in-law was in town hanging out, and he was like, "Dude, have you tried these sour beers yet?" I said, I've been having a few. Let's go make one. Let's just go out to the garage and make one. So we did a 10-gallon batch of Flemish red ale recipe split between these two glass carboys. One was pitched with Y yeast 3763 Roeselare Belgian sour blend. In this day and age, there are a lot of different microbes that people are getting. There's a lot of new yeast labs that are providing some really wonderful, yeast and bacteria blends. But back then, 2013, I feel like Roeselare was what everybody went to at the time. So I bought that, and I wanted to do a little comparison. So I split this same exact wort, into 2 different carboys, and I pitched White Lab's WLP 655 Belgian sour mix into the other one. I left both beers in primary. That was a thing. I actually talked with Mike Tonsmeyer about that, and he said, if you do that, you're bound. It's going to work fine, but you can get more complexity. So I thought, why not? It makes it easier. I don't risk oxidation, so whatever. And I stored these. We didn't have at the time. My youngest daughter, was just born in 2013, and so she wasn't using this restroom, and so we had kind of this extra restroom in our hallway. And I stored these beers in their carboys in the shower, just to kind of hide them and stow them away. We didn't have room in any closets, and they sat there for about 8 months before I actually opened the top and went and tested them out. At that point, neither beer really had any kreuzen. They didn't have a pellicle. Now, pellicles form because of the introduction of oxygen, is what I was taught, and so it made sense to me that they didn't. At 8 months, I did dip into each one. The Roeselare batch was much more complex, but not quite as acidic as I'd hoped, while the 655 batch was pretty boring overall. It almost just tasted like a regular beer to me. I let the Roeselare batch ride for a while and decided to add the dregs of some really good sour beers that my friends had given me to the 655 batch. 4 of the dregs, there were 4 bottles from the brewery and then 2 from Russian River, and one of them was Consecration, which is like one of the best sour beers I've ever had in my life. Let's see, about 4 months after that, a full year since the beers were brewed, I sampled them again and noticed that the 655 batch, the one that was hit with all the dregs, right, had developed a much more assertive acidity, which was expected because I added, these bugs from other commercial beers to it. The Roeselare batch was different, but still not as sour as I expected, so I gave them both another month, at which point the 655 batch was spot on. I let the Roeselare batch sit for another few weeks just to see what would happen. And by the end of those few weeks, I think the introduction of just a little bit of oxygen from using the turkey baster to pull samples out, I think that did it. In my experience, again, it developed this acidity where I was like, wow, here we go. Now we're rolling. So I cut it off there. I don't like bottle conditioning, and so I kegged both of these beers. And since those kegs are stainless, I didn't worry too much about being unable to clean them and reuse them for clean beers in the future. So I kegged them and force carbonated them to a little bit higher than what I would have expected, what you might expect for a standard beer or a standard sour beer, only because I later then racked all of those beers after drinking some, of course, racked them 2 bottles from there. So I didn't have much in the way of dregs in the bottom of these bottles. And I pressure transferred them from the keg into these bottles that were all sanitized, of course, and I stowed them away and put them in a cool, dark spot in my house, and I drank them very sparingly, cracking my last one of each of these batches nearly 4.5 years later. At some point in there, I did share these beers with Michael Tonsmeyer and a bunch of people from the Milk the Funk group as well. And we all agreed that everybody was on the same page. I didn't tell them what beer was from what batch or whatever, but there was a pretty good consensus that the Roeselare batch was more complex and overall more enjoyable, while the 655 batch was lacking in dimension. And Mike told me that he thinks that it might have surpassed the Roeselare batch had it been aged on wood, which is something we're going to talk a little bit about in the next segment. So I've since made a handful of other beers using these more traditional methods, but given the effort, I have kind of started opting for quicker souring methods because I am super impatient. But for my first, my first go at it, I thought it was a pretty neat experience. And the fact that I was able to compare these two different, micro blends and noticed a vast difference between them. It was a really eye-opening experience for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that what you described is a really common first go at it. What really starts to unlock the complexity and the balance is when you get into blending. And so I think that that's what a lot of first-time sour beer homebrewers are doing is they make a single batch and keg it up, and hopefully it tastes good. But
hopefully.
Right. And that's one thing we didn't talk about. And the downsides is you wait a year, and what if it doesn't taste good?
Oh, my gosh. I know.
Or what if it's too sour? And like you said, what if it's not sour enough?
Yeah.
And so that's where blending really comes in. And so, thinking back to my first time, I think my very first time brewing sour beer was a blended sour. I think that I made multiple batches with multiple micro blends and just really went. It's kind of like the guy that their very first brew is all grain. Just went in head first. But I did kind of cut my teeth with Brett beers. And we didn't really mention that earlier, but that is kind of like a fun little foray into this because you're really having to start think about your clean side equipment versus your sour side equipment once you start getting into Brett beers as well. And so Brett is a really easy way to kind of start on this pathway because it's a novel, traditional yeast source that creates these kind of sour beer adjacent flavors. Orval, of course, is a fantastic beer. And you need to understand how to use Brett well in a acidic traditional sour beer setting.
Yeah.
And so kind of starting with Brett beers, you can kind of cut your teeth on this kind of process. And then, that's what I did.
Yeah.
And then started just going whole hog into filling all of these carboys with wort with various micro blends so that ultimately I could come back and figure out the best blend to have something a little more balanced because I did not want to send people to the dentist when they tried my sour beer for the first time.
That's actually an interesting point. I made these sour beers that I just told you about were made before I'd ever even messed around with Brett on its own. And I had friends who were getting really into the whole sour beer brewing thing. I mean, this was back in the mid 2010s. So I was like 2014, 15. You probably remember when it was like everybody was brewing sour beers for a minute there. It just became the thing. And that was definitely the case with my group of brewing friends here in Fresno. And one of my buddies, Sean, was doing the experimental or more explorative thing where he was going out and getting all the different Bretts, right? So he had Brux and he had all, and he would split wort and he'd ferment each one. And we got and I was drinking those well before I made my sour beers. But it did give me, like you said, it gave me this kind of this perspective of what that contributes. And I love your terminology of saying, sour beer adjacent flavors. And that is to me, the best sour beers, more traditionally brewed ones that I've had. I think one of the things that is so unique about that is that they have this Brett character in addition to the acid. Whereas with these quicker sour beers, oftentimes it's clean fermentation with acid and that's it. And so the complexity to me does likely, at least it's influenced by the inclusion of Brettanomyces as a yeast that gets used to ferment it. Tell us a little bit about do you remember your first batch of sour beer? Did it turn out well? What was it like brewing it for you?
Yeah, I think my very first, traditional mixed fermentation sour beer was a Yeast Bay blend. Nick Impellitteri, amazing yeast whisperer. He actually lives in Portland now. This is before he moved out to Portland. And so me and some homebrew club guys got on the website and ordered a bunch of different tubes of blends. And my first one I ever pitched was the amalgamation blend.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been writing that same blend for like a decade now. And that's that's really cool about these mixed cultures is you really can maintain them. And it's not like USO 5 where you're worried about it turning. The point is to make sour, funky beer.
Right.
And so, simple grist learned from, the American Sours book, something like 50-50 wheat and Pilsner malt, something like that. 5 IBUs and then just pitch the amalgamation blend. And I think I probably pitched a little bit of fresh yeast as well. And in my experience, it's really whatever you have on hand is honestly fine.
Yeah.
standard Saccharomyces yeast, be it lager yeast to Hefeweizen yeast to Saison yeast, it doesn't really matter that much. But you just want to ensure that there's enough primary fermentation Saccharomyces to have a healthy fermentation. So you're not like lagging and struggling to begin with before it can even start to kick up, acidity and Brettanomyces character. So did that, and then had gotten some other tubes, and the next weekend brewed a different batch with a different micro blend, and then came back a few months later and got a new pH meter to really dive into this. You will need a good pH meter. And there was a blog post that I had seen that was kind of like how to blend sour beer. And they recommended, take detailed notes on each thing. And, one, you want to make sure it's not contaminated or like in a bad way, like super acetic acid, like vinegar. And maybe, you were saying that it got a little more acidic a couple weeks later. I'm wondering if it was just acetic acid, actually.
And not to cut you off, but I think it was, because that was another thing I was talking with Ed Coffey and Brian Hall at the time and Mike Tonsmeyer, was that the introduction of oxygen that's how acetic acid forms, right? It's why if you have a dump bucket for your beer, I keep a dump bucket right by my taps in my garage. And in the summertime, I go back 24 hours later and it just smells like malt vinegar, right? And so, but what Mike told me was a little hint of that. It actually, again, it can add to the complexity. So I think that's what it was. But carry on. I'm having fun listening to your story.
Well, and that's a good point, right? So let's say one of your carboys is super acetic. Maybe you can use some of that as like some character blending.
Yeah.
And you'll hear about that from traditional sour brewers, that if they won't necessarily immediately throw away a barrel of acetic, but it's not going to be the base of their blend.
No way.
So,
yeah.
And that is a, traditional characteristic of like lambic is a little bit of acetic. You definitely don't want too much. So like I was saying, I had like 3 or 4 carboys of sour beers, and I kind of think I quickly realized that if I wanted this to be a little bit more balanced, I was going to need to blend in some fresh beer as well, some fresh clean beer that wasn't sour, to kind of rebalance that acid blend to be a little bit more approachable for the palate experience I was going for.
Yeah.
And, that really leans on the Belgian tradition of goose, right? Where they're blending 3-year, 2-year, and 1-year-old lambic, because the younger lambic is inherently not as sour as the older lambic.
Right.
And the oldest lambic is traditionally the smallest piece of their blend. So although they're not necessarily blending in like, blonde ale from West Veterland or something, it was kind of leaning in that tradition of like adding a little bit of fresh beer to kind of balance out the acidity. And so looking at that blog that I was mentioning, it was saying, take detailed notes, make sure nothing's truly off. If it's truly off, dump it. And you can actually rate, maybe on like a little like 0 to 3 scale, the intensity of various things that you might find in sour beer, funk or Brett forwardness, oak character. I was adding boiled oak cubes to these fermentations at the time.
Yeah.
I've since not really done that because I've found you don't really need it. What else? Acidity. And then maybe, I don't know, fruity flavors or something like that could, ostensibly be found in there. And you kind of looking at these scales, you can try to start to balance each blend in one direction, right?
Yeah.
Because if one thing is way too funky and one is not sour enough, you can see how collectively you can ultimately achieve that gestalt that you might be looking for.
Right.
And so that was my first experience, was brewing several batches with different microbes in each, and then coming back months later and using a pH meter and my tongue and a, hydrometer to really dial in that blend. And then I, went to the farmer's market and got a whole bunch of peaches. And I think I was picking cherries off the cherry trees in my front yard, and figured out my blends and added them on fruit. And then here we go again. And then we got to wait for the fruiting process to finish.
Yeah. God, so much patience is required to make these beers. But again, it's one of those things where, the fact that you're waiting for it almost makes the experience of cracking open that first bottle all the better.
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You've invested so much effort into this. Now, one neat little thing is that back when Nick first started the Yeast Bay, I happened to be one of the 3 folks who did did beta testing for him. So I was messing
That's
around.
right.
Yeah, it was me, Ed Coffey, and Brian Hall, I believe. And we'd hop on like Zoom or Skype calls back then and have these cool things. And we were definitely messing around not only with amalgamation, but with a lot of other stuff he was just playing with and wanted our feedback on. That was a really fun experience. And Nick is just a killer guy. So check out the Yeast Bay if you're into looking for sour blends to use to make these sour beers. I think it's a great option. So we've already talked about what inspired us to brew sour beers and some of our experiences using a more traditional approach. When we're back from this break, we're going to focus more on our experiences designing recipes and break down some of the more unique methods used to make traditional sour beers. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERitor, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERitor.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. For the most part, brewing beer is pretty easy. The techniques used to make an ordinary bitter or pale ale are mostly the same as those one might use to make a stout or even a Vienna lager. When it comes to sour beer, there are some rather unique things brewers tend to consider. In this next segment, we're going to talk about our experiences designing recipes and actually brewing sour beers. Disclaimer, as you might expect, I don't have anywhere near the experience using these traditional methods that you do, Jordan, so I'm relying on you to make me look a little less stupid here. And let's start off with recipe design.
So why don't we start with the grain bill? Traditionally a lambic grain bill is something like, I think 60% Pilsner malt, 40% wheat. You can go 70-30, 50-50. I don't think there's really any hard and fast rules there. Traditionally, they were using unmalted wheat. I think that a lot of the grain bills that you're going to see in the sour beer world are going to kind of lean on that. I think that the big kind of outliers are Oud Bruin and Flanders Red. And Flanders Red, one of its really characteristic grains is the use of special B. And you wanted a little bit of that raisin kind of character in your red sour beer grist. Now, there are also dark sour beers that are coming out. I guess the Oud Bruin would be the closest analog in Belgium to that. Do you know of any examples of like black sour beers in Europe?
No, from the traditional breweries that we usually talk about, Cantillon, stuff like that, I've not seen, like sour stout. But I've definitely had, the brewery makes a delicious, or made, I don't know if they still do, a stout that they soured that was phenomenal. And this was like 10 years ago that I tried it. But yeah, I have not seen the darker. There was, I recall, back when I started to think about making sour beers, there being this whole movement against doing dark beers that were sour sour because the sour would clash with the roast and create like bad off flavors and all of this. But the ones that I've had have been surprisingly good.
Yeah, I don't like them personally, but I know that it can be done, and the Rare Barrel does make a dark sour. But I'm sure they're using a little bit of Carafa 3 at Mash Out or something to try to get the color without too much of the acridity or roast or whatever. But to each their own, and I know that the breweries had a lot of success with that style.
Yeah.
But I think that the hallmark of a grain bill for a sour beer is wheat, or a traditional sour beer, as it were. And I think that you're seeing that on the kettle sour side as well, that we use wheat. And there's a lot of arguments for why that matters. And I'm sure folks like exBEERience would have something to say about that. But I think that at the very least, we're paying homage to tradition. But ostensibly, it's adding, longer chain sugars or proteins or other things that are going to assist with the acidification and funkification of a long-term mixed fermentation schedule.
Yeah, that's I couldn't agree more. And when I approached designing, picking out the grain bill for the first beers I made, obviously they were inspired by Flanders Red. That's kind of what I was going for. That was the first sour beer that I ever tasted was a Flanders Red or in the style of Flanders Red, and I just thought it was phenomenal. So that's what I wanted my first one to be. And like you said, Special B, you got a fairly decent charge of Pilsner malt, stuff like that. But when I've made in the future, when I've used these more traditional approaches, I've definitely done the wheat and Pilsner malt. But I made this batch one time, and I think I used Roeselare in this one as well. That was it was both of those malts, but then I also added a hefty dose. I think it was like a 1 pound for a 5-gallon batch dose of honey malt, just to see what it did. And that beer came out. It was so good. It was one of those unique ones where you're going, wow, perfect for blending, which I did. I take some of my older sour beer bottles and just open them up and we'd mess around with different blends. But it was just a really nice, clean sour beer, if that makes sense. It didn't have much malt character to it, but the honey malt added this just really nice kind of toasty, nutty characteristic to the beer that I hadn't really gotten in other pale sour beers that I'd had.
What that makes me think of is, what about using honey for bottle conditioning a blended sour beer? Like, I think that if it was a fruited sour beer, it might get lost in the mix, but a traditional pale sour beer with no fruit can be a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And maybe honey as the priming agent would be a really nice way to expose those delicate, aromatics and flavors that accompanies honey without, driving it off via fermentation or boiling.
Yeah. And I think that's a great idea. I don't know how much of the honey flavor would stick around. The weird thing to me about honey malt is that it doesn't taste like honey to me. It tastes like almost granola-y, but with a hint of sweetness. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's definite honey sweetness or whatever, but it has this kind of nutty, toasty thing that I just think works in so many different styles. Right. I was on a honey malt kick back then, and that's why I did this, and I was just really happy I did. So, but I think like you said, the grain bills are typically going to be fairly simple, and sort of like any other style of beer, certain styles are going to have certain grains that you're just going to use in those. But a lot of people are just making pale sour beers these days. Like you said, using a 50-50 blend of Pilsner or even pale malt with some form of wheat. I've seen torrefied wheat. I've seen obviously flaked wheat. Malted wheat is another popular one that people are using. Mm-hmm. And you have all those options. So I think that's the base for more traditional, like you said, historically speaking, that is kind of what I think the approach tends to be.
Yeah, and this is not a time to bust out your bag of expensive Marisada or something like that.
Exactly.
Keep it simple. You don't need super characterful base malts. So keep it simple. So hops. I think there's really two kind of main strategies here. One is just kind of standard hops that you have laying around. Traditionally, we'd be looking at noble varieties like Hallertau or Tettening, and you're not looking for this is not an IPA, folks. So 5 IBUs, something like that. But what sour beer producers are experiencing is cultural drift, where their culture is getting crazy sour due to repeated fermentations and really learning to thrive in an acidic environment. So the longer a sour beer brewery is open, typically they have to keep inching up on the IBU scale just to combat the aggressive acidification that's happening with their house culture. So it is probably not unheard of for a place like the Rare Barrel to be in the 20 plus IBU range at this point because their cultures have drifted so far from where they started.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. So simple hops, traditionally we'd be looking at noble varieties, SOTs, etc. But obviously, there is one thing that really sets sour beer apart. And as far as I can tell, no other style in the BJCP guidelines, etc., would use this ingredient, which is aged hops. And we specifically use that in the lambic and goose tradition.
Yeah.
Now, Marshall, have you ever messed around with aged hops?
I refuse to. I hate the smell of old hops, and I've had delicious lambic and goose that were made with aged hops, but I've never made a lambic style beer, in that tradition at least. But I love the style, and the fact that they're using cheesy old hops is just that's such a weird thing to me, but it does work. I mean, I've had beers made with them, so but no personal experience myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you age them long enough, they eventually are pretty neutral smelling. And maybe that's an important thing to mention right here is that when we say lambic or goose, we're not in Brussels. We're not Belgian brewers that have, passed down from grandfather to grandson for, generations. So they really like to maintain the terminology of lambic and goose. And so when we say that, it's just kind of shorthand, but we want to, pay respect to those that have been doing this for years and just know that this is a lambic style, goose style. So at home, when making lambic and goose style, I think aged hops are really an important ingredient. And there is a character that's going to produce in a beer. And it's not going to work well on an IPA, I promise you. And so, this is really the time to use those old hops. And it's kind of cool from a homebrewer's perspective. If you, at the bottom of your freezer, you find a 8-year-old bag of Cascade, maybe those could be your first launch into lambic aged hop, brewing.
Yeah.
And so historically, they would use noble varieties. However, there are definitely modern traditional sour beer brewers like DeGard and Tillamook that will use Tillamook, Oregon, that will use aged American hops. So I think that in my experience, from a home brewing standpoint, really any variety of aged hops is fine. And the way that you do that is you simply open the bag and put it in your basement and forget about it for 3 years, 1 year at least, I think. You want the oxygen to be flowing. You don't want anything that mitigates hop aging, namely vacuum sealing or cold temperatures.
Right.
And that's pretty much all it takes. And I've used hops as old as 10 years old. I know Cantillon is, they'll even use just 1-year-old hops. And so it kind of depends on what your access is and how frequently you're doing it. You might even want to reach out to a brewery that might have old hops laying around. I think that there are some debittered equivalents that are out there on the market, as well as some aged hops that you might be able to access from hop companies that just literally had stuff sitting around for too long.
Right.
So they can then transition it to the sour beer market. But I think that is definitely a characteristic ingredient in at least the lambic and goose styles is an aged hop.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've heard a lot of, and so I know it's being done. Again, I haven't tried it, but the next big ingredient is going to be microbes, the yeast, your souring bacteria, all of that stuff. We're going to break down more of the fermentation side things here in a minute, but just to get it out there are different ways to inoculate wort so that it ends up fermenting and souring. And one way is to use a cool ship versus pitching lab sourced yeasts or blends, micro blends, stuff like that. I've never done. I did mess around one time with allowing some leftover wort from like a Blondale brew day to just sit under a tree in my front yard. It was like 110 degrees outside, and the I wrote about it on the website. The experience was not very good. We'll put it that way. It tasted. I made a beer with it. I definitely got some yeast and made a beer with it. But with coolships, there really is, again, this is a very romantic, in my opinion, approach to inoculating wort that makes phenomenal, or can make absolutely phenomenal beers. I know that a lot of the big breweries we've already mentioned do some form of natural inoculation in this way. I've not done it. You can also get more characterful yeast. I know you mentioned, Jordan, that the yeast strain that you're using for your clean fermentation piece probably doesn't matter. I think a lot of people do tend to stick with more Belgian styles, which are more phenolic and can put off more fruity esters and such. I don't know how much of that comes through, but again, in sticking with tradition, that is a common way to go. I've made sour beers where I co-pitch something like Flagship, the Chico strain, and that works perfectly fine as well. It'd be really interesting to see how those yeast characteristics come through in a comparison on traditionally fermented sour beers. But yeah, those are some of the basics. I don't know. Have you tried using a coolship, stuff like that?
Yeah, I've done the coolship thing in a couple different ways. I think an important thing to think about from the professional standpoint is that traditionally the coolship room is wood, and the hot wort is racked, if you will, over into the coolship and is steaming the room, right? And so the steam, the condensation is collecting on the roof and dripping back into the cooling wort. And theoretically, that wood component is really important there. When a new lambic style brewery will open, traditionally they will get a bunch of bottles of Dre Fontainen and Cantillon and will literally pop them up and spray them all over the walls. And so there is a theory that there's something living in the wood, either by force, like in that method, or just over the years of producing these beers, as well as there's going to be stuff living in the barrels and fooders that they're reusing as well.
Yeah.
And so the coolship obviously is getting yeast and microbes from the natural environment. These coolship rooms will have, open kind of windows at the top of the ceiling to let cool air in. And you mentioned that you did that experiment at 100 plus degrees. And that is a really important thing that they believe in Belgium, is only doing coolship on ideal temperature nights. And I think it's something like the temperature does not exceed 40 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. That information is out there. And so they think that there are certain microbes that are ideal, that exist in those cooler nights. And if it gets too hot, the stuff that's, really rampaging in the air at that time is not going to make great beer. So I have done a true spontaneous fermentation, like coolship style, with no additional microbes added, twice. One time it did not ferment. And then one time it was absolutely horrifically disgusting. And I was like, I think I would get sick if I drank this. I couldn't swallow it, Marshall. Oh,
I love that both of your experiences with that were awful.
But I didn't have the coolship room where I don't think my girlfriend would like that, because I do have wood rafters in here if I was to spray lambic all over the ceiling. But there is a good kind of way that you can hack this at home. And what I've had really good success is we did the turbid mash and the whole traditional lambic brew day. And then we did the coolship in a basement with an open window. And then the next day we pitch built up dregs from traditional lambic and goose bottles like Cantillon and Dre. And that, I think, can get you the best of the both worlds. Maybe ostensibly we are getting some of the natural, microbes from the Portland air.
Sure.
But if we're not, we have a kind of an insurance policy with a resume, which is these microbes from world-class goose and lambic.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really good way to approach the lambic style. And I would argue that lambic and goose is a fundamentally different experience organoleptically than other sour beers.
Without a doubt.
Spontaneous fermentation tastes different than whatever you can create via these, a piece of Brett, a piece of lacto, a piece of PDO, and a piece of sac.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. Absolutely. And again, my my cool ship, it wasn't really a cool ship, but my spontaneous fermentation attempt was also awful. The first time I ever almost had some bottle bombs, I had to go and open up all the bottle. It was awful. It was terrible. I don't recommend doing what I did. And it may be that the whatever was rampaging in the air was due to the 105, 110 degree, weather that's like 40C, 45C, something like that. So, all right, that is kind of the yeast side of things, the ingredient side. Water chemistry, we don't need to spend too much time on. I don't know if there's like a typical mineral profile. I just went for something that was neutral when I made mine. So I think I did a balance, something like 1-to-1 sulfate to chloride. pH considerations, obviously, that's one thing. This is sour beer, but in terms of mineral profile, do you have something you prefer? Or
yeah, I'm definitely a big believer in water chemistry, and that's what kills me with these short and shoddy brews is not diving into that. And so, but this is the one time where I think that it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I've messed around with a little bit, like add 50 ppm calcium or something, but realistically, I think that this is the one time where you can be pretty short and shoddy, but while maintaining, tradition.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't worry too much about mineral profile adjustments or even pH adjustments, because as long as you have a good, healthy culture, it's gonna acidify. Obviously, on the kettle souring side, there is a bit of a different equation there,
right?
Which we can talk about in a different episode.
Yeah, I'm with you. When it comes to mash pH, that's something I don't pay much attention to in general, anyways. In part because the water that I have is it buffer. I get a mash pH that's right within line where you kind of need it for pretty much every style that I brew. So I'm lucky on that. And also, when it comes to sour beer, you're focused more on pH later on down the line. And I think that's where you really want to focus. The idea with mash pH is you just want to get good conversion. And so that just do what you normally do there. Now, speaking of the mash, I think there are some really interesting things to talk about in terms of mashing sour beers, particularly as it relates to lambic and goose. Now, I was taught when I approached brewing my first few sour beers to go with a bit higher of a mash temperature because that favors alpha amylase, right? So you're going to have these long chain dextrins that are in your wort, a more dextrinous wort, which allows the Brettanomyces in particular the Brett will munch on it. It might take a little bit more time, but it also produces more of those really Brettanomyces-like characteristics that you kind of want in a traditional sour beer. Am I way off on that? That was something that one of my local buddies told me, and so I just kind of always did that. I'd mash somewhere upwards of like 158 to 160.
Yeah, one thing we didn't mention in the yeast segment was there's kind of two main approaches to using lab pitches, and I think we hinted at this earlier, but there is a co-pitch,
right,
where you pitch your sac and your bugs, as we used to call them, all together. And that is a really that in that scenario, the mash temperature doesn't necessarily matter as much. But this kind of like old school homebrewer method of you would do a clean fermentation of like a saison strain, then add your bugs in secondary. That's where the higher mash temperature is arguably a good idea, because you don't want to attenuate down to 0,
right,
and then have nothing left for the secondary pitch of bugs to work on. But if you're doing a co-pitch and you just add them all on the same day and you walk away for a year, I don't think the mash temperature matters as much, because those microbes are going to start going to work mid-fermentation and are going to have plenty of sugars to get at.
Yeah. Good point. And that's funny, because I was the person who told me that was somebody who was still racking into secondary and pitching their bugs there, because that was a common approach, right? Was you would ferment clean with a Belgian strain usually back in the day, and then you'd rack to a secondary, and that's where you'd pitch all your bugs, and that's when your waiting starts, right? Mm-hmm. And I left mine in primary, so yeah, maybe the mash temperature didn't matter too much. I've never done a turbid mash. Can you describe a little bit of your experiences using a turbid mash? And I've heard they are god awful to do. So
yeah, I haven't done one in years, and I really want to get back to it. So me and a buddy were doing a lambic goose project, and once a year in the winter lambic brewing season, we would get together and do a traditional turbid mash brew day. And we do the aged hops, like I mentioned, the kind of modified coolship approach, the whole 9 yards. So a turbid mash, from a conceptual standpoint, is basically a step mash, where you draw off a little extra wort, like you would a decoction, and you heat it up to a like 175 degree realm to denature the enzymes. But it's called a turbid mash because what you're drawing off is like cloudy wort.
Yeah.
And you do this maybe a couple times. The American Sour Beer book has a really great write-up that we would follow. That we'd open the book up every year on the day and follow the instructions because we forgot them after a year passing. And for those that don't own the book, you should buy it. But if you haven't yet, there is like a 2009 blog post that article was based on the Mad Fermentationist blog. So following along the blog, it's basically a step mash, and you're pulling off this cloudy wort, and you're denaturing it, and then you add that back in at the end for mash out. And in theory, you're adding long chain, denatured sugars that are going to be not, easily fermentable by Saccharomyces. That gives the long spontaneous fermentation something to chew on. And I have done both turbid mash lambic style beers and what I was calling cheater lambics, where I was just doing a simple standard like single infusion mash regimen.
Yeah.
And I swear there's a difference. There really is some complexity that brutal Brut adds. And so I really think it's a fun like homebrew club, event to do once a year, because you kind of have to like pool everyone's equipment to pull it off, because the boil times on these turbid mashes are like 3+ hours.
Wow.
And perhaps part of that is boiling off the cheesiness of the hops, but you're also creating this like really diluted wort in the traditional turbid mash process that you need to concentrate down to ultimately like 1045 or something. This isn't a high OG beer. And so this was all done in the pre-all-in-one era. And so I've been racking my mind trying to think about how can I do this effectively in one of these new like claw hammer systems or something like that. So I'm excited to get back into it and resume the tradition in the electronic brewing world.
Yeah. So that's mash considerations. You can obviously make a great, Flemish red or Ode Brune or sour beer traditionally, made sour beer without going through the trouble of a turbid mash. That really is something that I think lambic and goose brewers are focusing more on. So step mashing, you can do that if you want to. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that step mashing really was intended initially just for better conversion of low modified malts. So you choose what you want to do there. I don't think there's really anything you have to think about when it comes to just boiling the wort. It's basically the same as any other beer. And at this point, it's not like you've got acid in the, in your wort yet anyway. So you're just boiling basically to condense the wort to get whatever bitterness you're going to get out of those cheesy hops or whatever hops you're using. Any thoughts on your end in terms of things people might want to keep in mind when it comes to the boil for sour beer?
Yeah, I would say if you're going for lambic, you're looking at 2+ hours. But if you're going for, any other traditional style, be it American mixed ferm sour beer or a Flanders Red, 60 minutes with a little bit of hops is all you need. But in the American variant of traditional, you can get really interesting character from adding some sexier hops in your boil. Do a flame out with Nelson, something like that. And as long as it's a mixed fermentation, approach on the cold side, I think that we're still in the traditional realm.
Yeah.
And you can get some really interesting character via boil hops on sour beer. Yeah,
I'm almost certain it was Mike Tonsmeyer who shared maybe it wasn't, but he shared a sour beer that he made. And my experience with sour beers that Michael has made have been that they are not enamel peelers. They are like perfectly balanced funk with acid. They're beautiful, but I'm almost certain he made one that he dry hopped with Nelson, and it was an experience like no other. A very, very unique. And that's the neat thing about sour beers with modern dry hopping methods. When you hybridize these more traditional types of sour beers, you can really create some just wild tasting stuff with dry hopping and stuff like that. So, well, now we are at, I think, what is the most important aspect when it comes to making sour beer, and particularly in these more traditional approaches, is the fermentation and souring process. It takes a long time. We've talked about that, but there are some things that at least I was taught going into making my first few sour beers that I still kind of hang on to, that I think are kind of interesting. One of them is that it's always better, and this was Malcolm Fraser's big thing back when he was a contributor to Brewlosophy, to adjust your wort pH down to below 4.5, I believe, something like that, or 4.0, before you inoculate, before you add your bugs. Is that something that you do, and have you experienced faults if you haven't done that?
I have not done that. I don't think. I would definitely recommend that for a kettle sour. I think that it's really another case of insurance. You're making sure that things aren't going to go wrong before it's too late. And I've yet to get burned and have a batch that was a dumper outside of those spontaneous attempts that I mentioned earlier. So, but I'm sure that's a best practice. And I think that there's even some literature like testing that on various lambic production. And I would say that that would be probably a really important thing to do if you're looking at a true spontaneous fermentation. But with lab pitches, sure, why not? But if you forget, you're going to be fine probably.
I actually, now that you mention it, I do think that his recommendation, Malcolm's recommendation, was for spontaneous fermentation, that you want to get it down to this point where it's less likely to be infected, essentially, by some wild yeast or whatever. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing that I heard, I'm curious your thoughts on this one, is that for sour beer, lower pitch rates are actually desired because you want that yeast, particularly Brettanomyces, right? But you're okay with those yeast pushing off extra stuff. You don't want to get the gross stuff, but if they're going to push off more phenols or more esters, that's an okay thing because that again is what those bugs are going to go to work on. Am I way off on that? That's something that I absolutely did by pitching just a single pouch of, 2-month-old Rosalaire and WLP 655 in those first few that I made.
Yeah, like everything in brewing, it depends. So with Brettanomyces primary, for example, the thought there is that maybe we should be looking at more like lager pitch rates. But with Saccharomyces, I would say kind of like a standard ale pitch rate is probably sufficient. And if you're a little low, it's going to be fine due to the souring and funkification. But the microbes themselves, you don't need a ton. And so I think that especially when you're doing the staggered pitch, adding a little bit at the end, especially with Brett, I think people are finding that works really well to give it that stress. But I think that from a home brewing perspective, it's pretty forgiving. And it's like, as long as you have stuff that's somewhat alive, it's probably going to work okay. And I wouldn't stress too much about pitch rate. I would just make sure you have some alive Saccharomyces and then that your, micro blend is, reasonably healthy. I wouldn't worry too much about pitch rate.
Yeah, good. That's good. That's kind of was my approach as well. I just didn't think about it too much. We already spent some time talking about, natural inoculation or spontaneous fermentation versus pitching lab sourced, and then the difference between co-pitching, just meaning putting everything in together, or staggering that. Have you ever? I actually have friends who disagree on this. That I have one buddy who swears that you got to ferment clean first, make the regular beer, and then sour it. And then I have another friend who's like, get the sour thing going while there's all that sugar still present, and then pitch your yeast and ferment it with that. Have you done either of those? What's your take on that, on those, that conflict, I guess?
Yeah, I've done both, and I find the co-pitch easier. And I think that like Flanders Red, arguably, that's the more traditional method that allegedly there's something going on while aging on the yeast cake. But I think that the time that you want to look at a staggered is for a Brett beer. And again, this is sour beer adjacent, but we can't, ignore that conversation because it is part of this tradition. And if you want to make a world-class Brett beer, ferment clean first, and then do a light staggered secondary pitch of Brett or in the bottle. And that's going to be a really good way to express the Brett character in a more beautiful way, in my opinion. But when it comes to true acidic sour beer, I'd say whatever way works best for your process or your persuasion at the day is fine.
Yeah. Sounds good to me. You can pitch dregs all you want. That's one of the fun things, I think. Now, one of the arguments that I've heard from people about pitching dregs is that chances of you being able to replicate the same beer over and over again will likely be difficult because either you're pitching different dregs, you forgot the dregs that you did pitch, whatever it is. So just keep that in mind. I think it's fun because one-off batches of sour beer are just always rad, super fun to drink. Aging. These beers, once they're done, they can stand even more aging. And I know that when it comes to aging, there are things that you can age beer on. I have not made a wooded or oaked sour beer to date. And I like them a lot. It's not something I've gotten into. I know that you have. Let's talk a little bit about your approaches to aging sour beer.
Yeah. So like you, nowadays, I'm just using my original carboys. And so those are a good thing to hold on to once you upgrade to like a Delta Firm tank or something like that. And you just rack it in there, pitch your microbes, put the airlock on, and then put it in a dark corner and forget about it for 6 months or so. Just make sure that you're keeping your airlocks filled up, because you don't want those to dry out and thus creating a vat of acetic acid. Yeah. But I did have a barrel, and I used it successfully for a couple years. It was one of those 5-gallon used whiskey barrels that homebrewers can get, and someone in my club got it, and they turned some clean, dark, whiskey aged beers through it. And I was able to come onto it after the whiskey character had been more stripped, and would do either secondary or primary in the barrel. And it definitely was picking up wood character with so much contact surface area. Unfortunately, after a year or 3 of use, it started getting mold around the bung hole, and the rule is once you see mold, burn it. So I haven't gotten a new barrel since then, and I've found that you really don't need a barrel to make beautiful world-class sour beer at home, but it's certainly a fun thing to play around with. Sure. And so it's worth a shot if you get your hands on one. Yeah.
Where I live, it's just too hot during the summer, and I don't have a place in my house. I've got 3 kids, a wife, a dog. I don't have a place to store a barrel. So when I have messed around with wood in clean styles, it's always, wood alternatives. And I know a lot of people are there's those honeycombs, you can buy cubes, you can buy chips, who are making fantastic world-class sour beer in their homes using these alternatives, and that's absolutely a great way to go. You mentioned blending earlier. I have my blending amounts to taking bottles of sour beer that I made and blending them in different portions in the glass just for fun. I've never done what my friends Ed Coffey and Brian Hall really sitting down and focusing on making the best ratio of different sour beers that they have on hand to that they're going to ultimately end up packaging in those ratios. You have messed around with this, right, Jordan?
Indeed, I have, and I really think that's the key to world-class sour beer at home in the mixed fermentation realm. That's one of the other arguments for kettle souring is you don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And so, but I've mentioned this before, but one of my biggest tricks here is you need some clean beer, because if you're using these amazing micro blends that the labs are putting out these days, and you don't use too many hops in your boil, it is going to sour well beyond the realm of enjoyability. And so by blending in some clean, dry beer, like Saison, something that's attenuating well, so you're not creating bottle bombs in a world where you are going to be bottle conditioning it, I think that's a really good way to balance the intense acidity you're going to get in your mixed fermentations with a brighter character that's also just going to liven it up a little bit because it's newer. And another technique you could use there is also Brett beer, is you could make a Brett beer on your sour brew day so that at least you have something that is dry and attenuated. And then if your sour beer isn't funky enough, you can blend in some Brett beer to kind of balance that character out as well.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I love it. I always thought it would be a lot of fun to sit down with people who know what they're doing and like be a part of the blending process, just sampling little sips of different blends. And then, there's obviously a subjective component, which is a part of the fun of being the brewer, is that you get to pick which one, you move forward with. I just think that's really cool. When talking about packaging and serving, obviously I think it's well known that a lot of the best sour beers out there are bottle conditioned. I have not. I just avoid bottle conditioning because, 1, it takes too long. 2, I'm not a big fan of the bottling process. I've only ever kegged my sour beers, but then I usually do rack them to bottles for storage and aging. What's your approach to packaging these sour beers?
I'm a strong believer that every style of beer has a style of glass that's best to serve it in. Trappist beer, you have the big goblets, Helles and a big, Stein maybe. And similarly, I think every beer has a packaging technique that's appropriate for the style. I think IPAs are best on draft, and I think sour beers are best bottle conditioned. I think that you want these things to be super effervescent, 3.5, 4 volumes CO2. You're not going to realistically be able to do that at home on draft. And so bottle conditioning is a appropriate format for that. Obviously, you need thick brown bottles. They sell Belgian style bottles at the homebrew store that can accommodate these super high levels of carb. You can either crown cap them or cork and cage them. Cork and caging is super fun, and it's a way to really dive into the tradition, but not necessary. And with that kind of method, you can get this crazy carbonated beer that really elevates the experience. But the other reason I think this is important is, I mean, who wants to drink 5 gallons of sour beer in a month, right? It's like not reasonably possible. And so these beers don't lend themselves to sessions. And so having them stored away in your closet, they really will last for years.
Yeah.
And so it allows you to dip into them when the occasion presents itself. They make for beautiful gifts. You are the most popular person at a dinner party when you show up with like a 6-pack of interesting fruited sour beers. So I think that bottle conditioning is the way to go because you get that high level of carbonation. You're matching the tradition, and you're getting an experience that you can hold on to for a while. But there's actually one other thing I want to say there is a thing in sour beer production is that a bottle can, quote, get sick, where it starts to pour ropey. And this is Pediococcus creating these like long chain proteins or something. And Brettanomyces over time will consume those, and it will no longer be ropey. And if you put it on draft, if it's cold, I'm guessing you'd probably, skip that risk. But being in the bottle, oftentimes traditional sour beers need a little bit of time before they taste good, especially in the lambic and goose world. And so by letting them hang out at cellar temps for like maybe 6 months even, that's when they start to really shine. And so there's some magic that happens in the bottle. And in my opinion, in traditional sour beer brewing, it truly is the final step.
I have never, like I mentioned, I've never bottle conditioned a sour beer. The best sour beers that I've had from other homebrewers, and I think arguably from most of the commercial sour beers that I've had, have been bottle conditioned. And I agree. I do think that there's something that happens in that process. The way that beer is stored, the temperature that it's stored at, whatever that is, the carbonation level, the experience of that carbonation on my palate compared to a kegged forced carbonated beer, it's just different. And I agree. I do think, particularly if you're sticking to the most traditional of methods, you're going to bottle condition these beers, and it's a wonderful experience. We love sour beers. I love traditionally made sour beers. I'll drink them whenever I get the opportunity to do that. I don't brew them as much as I like because I am impatient, but that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Do you have any final words on your experiences with traditional sour beer brewing, Jordan?
Don't be afraid. Give it a shot. It's really fun. And do your research and you can make a really wonderful sour beer. It's easier than you think.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more about brewing sour beers, grab American Sour Beers, the book by Michael Tonsmeyer. Go check out Milk the Funk. You are not going to find a more rich resource for making these types of funky and sour beers than Milk the Funk. We're big fans of those folks, and they've created an amazing resource for sour beer brewers. All right, don't forget to check out our podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.